Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
My big fear is that by the time there is any kind of justice, it will get announced to a room that is empty apart from me and maybe a few descendants, and there won't be any veterans left to actually hear it.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. The race to build a British nuclear bomb sucked thousands into its vortex who are still dealing with the effects of radiation today. Veterans, widows, children, scientists and indigenous people all subjected to fear, radiation and experimentation. But for 7 decades, the veterans who created it have been denied truth and justice. I speak with Daily Mirror journalist Susie Boniface, whose new book, Exposed: The Secret History of Britain's Nuclear Experiments, reveals the full price they paid for our peace and prosperity. I'm delighted to welcome Susie Boniface to our Cold War conversation.
Everyone had seen during the World War the Allies and the Nazis racing each other to try to get to the atomic weapons first, the heroes of Telemark and all that. And America obviously got there first and then detonated too. And they were clearly, for anyone who had been aware of what was going on, they were the most devastating weapons mankind had ever developed. And therefore, whoever had those weapons was going to be in charge in the new world order. I mean, the book sort of starts on an account of the first attack in Life magazine in Hiroshima. And one of the photographers, writes a note home and says, "We saw Hiroshima today, or what little is left of it. We were just so shocked that we just felt like weeping." And these are hardened war photographers who have already been through the Second World War, in which millions of people had died. And they were stunned. And so it was clear that after the Second World War, America was ahead of everybody. And in, I think it was 1946, they legislated not to share those nuclear secrets with anyone outside American citizens. And that was done for reasons of national security, and because they didn't want, these were such an awful weapons, you didn't want to share it and start telling people what they had. But at the same token, then everyone else was going, well, hang on, you've now got American hegemony. Anyone who doesn't agree with America, you're under their heel, basically. So the communists, the Russians tried to get it, the Chinese eventually did, and Britain was in a real bind because it wanted, as it is now, it wanted to be in a partnership with the States, but it was a junior partner. And when it had been this great colonial power, it was now very much the minor sort of side of things. But America wasn't going to share the secrets even with Britain because we were so full of Soviet double agents. And so you had people like Klaus Fuchs, who was an emigre, who had worked in Los Alamos, who had been interned in the UK, eventually gained citizenship, passed security clearances even, was working on the weapons program, and then later turned out to have been a really serious double agent who had given the Soviets just about everything he'd figured out in Los Alamos. And the Americans were kind of like, well, we can't trust the Brits because they're full of Reds. So you're not having anything. So Britain found itself in a situation where it was clearly on the side of America, but was not being sheltered by America. It was not behind America's shield. And it was a lot closer to Russia and Moscow, particularly, and the Iron Curtain than America was. So it was obviously going to be the first target. And you're out in the open. So the geopolitical reasons for having those nuclear weapons for all the nations that fought for it, but particularly for Britain, were really clear. I mean, one of the ministers said, we've got to have it, and it's got to have a Union Jack on it. And the fact we did it, the fact that our scientists who were a little bit Heath Robinson about it, William Penny, who was the father of the bomb, our Oppenheimer, was a brilliant mathematician, didn't want to do it, wanted to be a university teacher, kind of got asked to by Attlee. The fact they managed to come up with the ways of doing it without the help or the support of so many people who already had done it and knew it, and to do it when the country is still having rationing. We were exploding nuclear weapons and sending tens of thousands of pounds worth of plutonium to Australia to be obliterated secretly without Attlee telling the rest of his cabinet what he was doing or where the money was coming from. It all got shuffled sideways out of other budgets. And at the same time, people like my mum were still living out of a ration book. to do all that, I think in and of itself, just on that from a scientific perspective, is fascinating and extraordinary. We can argue about whether it's right or wrong, but I think what the scientists did deserves honouring as much as what the veterans did.
And I think people forget the situation that the UK was in at the end of World War II financially. I think rationing continued until 1952.
Yeah.
Severe spending constraints. They're trying to build the welfare state at the same time. And somehow they managed to find enough cash to develop this nuclear weapons program. Now, as you've described with the journalists who saw the horrors of the bomb in Hiroshima, massive damage from letting one of these off. So, you're not going to be able to test this in Yorkshire or somewhere like that. Where does the UK test these weapons?
Well, all the nations which were testing weapons, generally speaking, were pretty big. So Russia and America did test it within their own boundaries, or Soviet Union. They chose to test it in Kazakhstan on the steppes. And of course, Los Alamos was New Mexico and Nevada. But Britain was much, much smaller. And there was at one point, I found there was some discussion. I'll see if I can find it for you. There was some discussion about where on earth you could do some of these tests in the UK. And there was some consideration of the Thames estuary where they were testing various conventional armaments in the estuary at Foulness. There was talk about going up to Wick in northern Scotland. But I think at one point there was sort of some consideration of where you could do it. And it was decided that politically you couldn't be doing it up in Scotland because there's too many people in the sort of the House of Lords who've got grouse shooting moors up there and so on, and that would upset them. They looked at British Columbia and they just saw an icy waste and thought, well, this would do. And of course, these days we know those icy wastes are full of life and full of a biological extraordinariness of its own. But they eventually settled on about 3 different places. The first one they chose in 1952 was some uninhabited islands off the northwestern coast of Australia called the Montebellos. And they had actually been inhabited by Aboriginal people for tens of thousands of years, but they had sort of departed pretty much by this time. And so they sent a warship south called HMS Plym, which was coming to the end of its useful life. And the big fear at that moment in time was for Soviets to sail a nuclear weapon somehow into a British port and to detonate it and thereby basically bring a halt to Britain's sea power. And, we still had an empire at the time. It was a big issue to destroy one of our ports. And that's what they did. They detonated this weapon in the hull of HMS Plym. And I spoke to people who, and they're in the book, who sadly have now passed away, but who were at that first bomb test, which was codenamed Operation Hurricane. And he said that all that was left was just this shape scorched on the seabed. There was vaporized lumps of metal rained down out of the sky. And that was also, it was not only the first experiment of what Penny and his men knew how to do with nuclear weapons, it was the first time that there were experiments on the humans that were there. There were troops that were ordered at ground zero, and I quote, with and without respirators, according to documents that were written at the time, in order to then examine how much radionuclides were in their urine afterwards. There were some who were ordered to march up and down windward of this particular spot or that particular spot, and they were examining the humans for what entered their body and what came out and what that meant, and that all makes perfect sense from this perspective, and from theirs as well, from the idea that you're fearing nuclear holocaust every day. You're fearing how civilians are going to survive radiation and what effect it will have on them over the long term. And you should really examine the men that are there to see what has happened to them. The fact is that those men weren't told about it. They weren't told the results. They weren't told they were being examined often. And so there was no informed consent for what was a human experiment. It started in 52 and as far as many of the veterans are concerned, it's still continuing today, 73 years later.
Yeah, it's absolutely unbelievable. The service people that were in these areas weren't told about the danger, and also the indigenous population, which we'll come onto in a moment. How many British servicemen and scientists participated in these tests?
It's about 22,000 British. There's about another 17,000 Commonwealth or Australian troops. And then there's a few hundreds more Canadian, New Zealand, Fijian. So the total figure isn't really clear. No one's ever come up with it. It's roughly 40,000 people. And that makes it the biggest tri-service operation since D-Day. And it's the one which, of course, just doesn't get taught in schools. It's the one that's not commemorated. It's the one that when you go to the cenotaph, as I've been lucky to do once or twice with these guys, they're at the back of the queue. They were the other forgotten veterans from the events that didn't matter too much to people or didn't get the big headlines.
Absolutely. So the weapon tests are atmospheric tests. So they're being detonated in the sky or above the surface. Was there any attempt at safety measures for the personnel involved?
Safety is one of those words which I laugh at quite cynically when I hear it in relation to the tests. Your listeners and most people would probably say, well, we didn't know so much about it then, and didn't know what was safe and what wasn't. And in one hand, that's true, but on the other, it's a total lie. So it was well known that radiation was very, very bad from the time that it was discovered at the end of the 19th century. Marie Curie was buried in a lead-lined coffin for a reason. And it had been established by a chap called Hermann Joseph Müller in 1946. I think he won the Nobel Prize for establishing there is no such thing as a safe amount of radiation. So, you or I could just go for, say, a dental x-ray tomorrow, and the chances are that's going to do us no harm whatsoever. But if you have a lot of dental x-rays, it probably would increase your risk of some harm. But some people would have some kind of personal proclivity already, which means that one x-ray is going to slightly raise their risk of something. It can have an effect at every level. Every amount of radiation can do some kind of damage, whether it's temporary or permanent. And you don't really know who it's going to hurt and who it isn't. And they established that in 1946. And then 1952, when they started the first nuclear weapons test, and this is something which continued through subsequent testing as well over more than a decade, the British set what they called safety limits for the amount of radiation you could be exposed to. So they told the troops, this is your limit. And it's safety up to this point, and it's not safety on the other side of it. That was, you could call it a lie, you could call it propaganda, you could call it unscientific, you can just call it bollocks. But there is no such thing as a safe amount of radiation. They knew that at the time. The problem was, I think, they had some wriggle room because there were various international bodies, which of course were sponsored by the British and the Americans and everyone else, who were saying, oh no, we think the amount of radiation that's pretty safe is about here, chaps. And so everyone then took their, the American government, the British government took their safety limits from the internationally recognised standard. And the fact that the internationally recognised standard had pretty much been written with their needs to detonate nuclear weapons in mind was neither here nor there. What has changed since then is that every time they set I'm going to say safety limit, but it's just a bogus phrase. It's a risk limit. It minimises your risk. It doesn't make it zero. But that amount of risk that is considered safer has always been reduced down over the time. It's never, ever been increased because, we were too cautious. But the documents from the scientists who were discussing these constantly say, well, we think these safety limits are probably too safe. We can probably go a bit further because we're being too cautious. And there was one incident, actually, in 1956. They were setting safety limits for HMS Diana, which was the destroyer which had to sail through fallout several times in 1956 for a total of 16 hours. And the chap who was sort of in charge of the medical standards for that operation said, well, it's better that we get the results rather than that in these very expensive missions, we fail to get the data. Words to that effect. And so they actually increased the unsafe safety limits they had set for this particular mission. And that happened over and over again. And then later on, you also found there were lots of veterans who gave evidence who said, now look, I was given the little film badges, dosimeters they're called, which have some camera film inside, which would measure certain amounts of exposure of radiation. And they said, well, I was given a badge and I dropped it or I lost it in the course of my work. So they never really knew what dose I had. There were others who were in charge of developing those badges who said, well, the chemicals were spoiled in the sun, or we didn't bother to do it properly, or it was a Friday afternoon and we chucked them all in the bin. And there are others who said, well, we got overtime for going into the forward area to do data collection or something. And once your badge got over a certain limit, you couldn't go in the forward area anymore. So we left the badges in the Land Rover. And because they wanted their overtime, of course. And even so, even the badges that they did manage to actually hand out and develop, they only went to about 24% of the men who were there. So the vast majority were never checked in any way, shape or form. So the argument from the government that these men were safe, well, how can you prove it? You can't prove it because you never actually checked them. And that, by any token, should be negligent, you'd have thought. I mean, the whole point, to go back to your earlier question about why we wanted these weapons, is not just because they could, with one bomb, you could flatten an entire city. You could have Dresden, but with one plane and one bomb. The idea was that you could deliver that kind of destruction very, very quickly. And then for hundreds or thousands of years afterwards, you would also be delivering a legacy of disease and death and toxicity and undrinkable water and unplowable fields, and that you would just destroy the country around it for millennia. That is the point of the weapon. The fact that there is that radiation, which can be so pernicious and devastating, is why it's such a big, scary thing that no one's wanted to detonate in anger since 1945. And the British government's attitude has always been, well, our chaps were too far away for that to be the case. Well, flying through the cloud, walking through the fallout, marching through the fallout, sailing through the fallout, being made to walk up and down in it with and without respirators is not being far enough away that you don't have any effect. And it's a human experiment. And there isn't any other way to describe it. And I should say, actually, I'm ashamed of myself that for the first few years of working on this story, I just didn't think that was true. I listened to the veterans say we were guinea pigs, we were lab rats. And I sort of quite smugly thought to myself, well, no, you weren't. You were treated negligently, but there's no evidence of that. And I think you're leaping to conclusions, understandably so. And I understand why you feel that way. But, I think I know better than you. And it was only when I started seeing some of the evidence we've found in the last couple of years that I realised I was wrong, and they were telling the truth all along. They were exposed in every possible way.
And we come on to some of the personal stories in a bit, because they're both shocking and unbelievable in terms of how the government have tried to block any compensation to these veterans. Now, you mentioned Montebello Island, an uninhabited test area, but the tests were also going on at Maralinga in Australia, where there was an indigenous Aboriginal population. One of the stories that I found really shocking, and there's a lot of shocking stories in the book, was of the Milpuddy family, who were an Aboriginal family who were in the Maralinga test area.
Yeah. So after the first bomb and hurricane, there was clearly a need. We found a bomb that we can blow up, but we've just left it sitting in a ship. And after that, there came the logistical issues of how you're going to deliver the weapon. They needed to make it smaller. They needed to make it something you could get in a missile. The first ones, they wanted to drop and use gravity to deliver it. And then later on, as the program developed, they wanted to make it smaller still to go on the tip of a missile so you could fire it at an enemy. You didn't have to waste a plane going into enemy areas and so on. And so they moved these. There was obviously a need for a bigger series of tests, and they couldn't sustain a big naval presence out in the ocean for a long period. So they moved into an area of South Australia which they considered barren, arid and empty. And they were told by local officials, there was just areas that were used by one or two elderly blacks. And they really didn't understand anything about how Aboriginal culture worked. They chose this plot of land, which they decided to call Maralinga, which means in one of the Aboriginal dialects, field of thunder. which just shows they know how much machismo is dripping out of the Ministry of Defence at this point. And they just set up this. It was near Woomera Rocket Range where they'd been tested. They were later going to test the Blue Streak missile. And they had conventional explosives there. They also had a nearby base and that they could get supplied from, but they were well out in the middle of nowhere as far as they were concerned. The problem is that what the white man just couldn't see, to the Aboriginal native people, Maralinga was basically their M25. You would travel for hundreds of miles across the continent, across the outback, to see family or for spiritual reasons or for rituals. And you might travel hundreds of thousands of miles in the course of a year with your family, going from what they called a rock hole road. So you go from a watering hole to a watering hole. And you, as far as the white man's concerned, it's barren and empty. But to someone who is of First Nations people would look at that and go, well, this is my larder. This is my drinking place. This is my home. And I know how to exist here quite happily. Thank you very much. And the Maralinga range was kind of put across that road like a steel beam in the middle of the M25. And they put up signs in English saying, keep out. Well, Aboriginal people didn't even speak English, much of them at that time. They were sort of educated in some of the local missions. They could quote bits of the Bible occasionally, generally only the kids. I certainly couldn't be reading signs. They had, I think, one to start with, and it expanded to two officers who would patrol the range to make sure there was no one coming in it who shouldn't be coming in it. But the range was about the size of Scotland and Wales combined. So, and these guys, I think they didn't even have a Land Rover for a bit. They used to send a plane up to see if they could spot fires. And then obviously what happened was if an Aboriginal person saw the white man's plane coming, they put the fire out and go and hide behind the tree because they don't want to know. So the efforts to keep Aboriginal people out of the area were next to non-existent. They certainly didn't work. And they weren't getting the word out to people who were crossing down their road, which they'd set off months earlier. And that's what Charlie and Edie, Emil Puddy and their family were doing. They were deciding to go from up north, down south, basically, via what had now become Maralinga without any awareness at all. And they were found in or very near a crater for a particularly nasty weapon, which was detonated in Operation Buffalo in 1956. It was called Marku, that bomb. It was a very small weapon, only 1.5 kilotons, so about a 20th of what had been detonated in Japan. But the purpose of it was to create as much fallout as possible. Instead of detonating it on a tower or from a balloon, they detonated it on the ground, because they wanted to study the fallout, and they made it a small yield so that it wouldn't be so toxic they couldn't examine that fallout. And part of the point of that, apart from for civil defense purposes, was because they wanted to share it with the Americans. The Americans hadn't done that kind of thing, and it would sort of help us buy some more cooperation with our allies. So they detonated this thing in 1956, and then I think it was sort of fairly early in May 1957, Charlie, Edie, his wife, Henry and Rosie, who were their children, had just turned up and, were found basically camping. They'd lit a fire, they'd had some food, and they sort of wandered into the path of some troops who went, what? And what happened to them afterwards was just astonishing. So they weren't wearing very many clothes. And to the westernized soldiers that were dealing with them, that was shocking enough. But they needed to shower them in a decontamination shower. Now, Charlie and Edie and their family had never experienced warm water before. They certainly never experienced soap. The guy in charge ordered his troops not to touch the wife or daughter. So they went unshowered because of, social mores. Charlie and his son got put through the shower. I think Edie did end up getting washed at some point. Basically, when they started getting soaped, it went in their eyes and they screamed because of what on earth's going on. And then so the white native patrol officer is holding their eyes open to try and rinse the soap through. Now, to them, that was a kindness. To the people it's happening to, that's just adding to the trauma. They then shot the family's dogs in front of them and put them in a car and bundled them down to the nearest Lutheran mission. Now, they'd never been in a car before, So they were sick everywhere. Edie was pregnant at the time. Rosie was only 2. Henry was 11. Charlie was furious about the whole thing. Edie never spoke about it for a while because she felt that all she had seen were men were there. She just saw these men. So she assumed she was in a male area, which was something she shouldn't be allowed to do, and that she had trespassed. So, and that was something, I think, which was encouraged by the troops who were trying to encourage them not to tell anyone about what they'd seen at all. And in fact, the Australian officers who were running the range at that time made every effort really to cover it up. They were cabling London and going, well, we're not putting any of this in writing. We're not going to do this, not the other. No one spoke to the family about it. They just dumped them at this mission. And of course, a lot of other indigenous families had been forcibly relocated out to these missions as well. They just, before the weapons test, they kind of had a bit of a scoop of everyone they could find and chucked them out. So they were forcibly moved off their ancestral lands, out of their normal way of life. Charlie, I think, took to drinking, not unlike a lot of the others. They had a couple more children, and he sort of took himself off, went off on his own, and died of heart disease, I think, sometime later. And the whole family suffered health problems. Edie lost her baby. Their children, Rosie and Henry, had issues as they grew up, and they weren't really spoken to again until the 80s, when there was an investigation in Australia about it. And that was the first they'd really heard of any of the context of what had happened to them. And that's just one case. There are lots of stories which are unsubstantiated, but stories of troops finding dead people in the bush and having to bury them. There's stories of people being ordered to walk along the road to get to wherever. And of course, walking along the stretch of tarmac where there's no water made no sense, and they didn't know how to cope with that. So they died of thirst on the way to wherever they'd been ordered to. And then the native patrol officers, when they did find someone and radio it in and go, there's someone here, they just weren't believed, because the attitude by the officers back in base were, well, you're putting the needs of a few brown people above that of the British Commonwealth. How dare you? The British took down to the Australians took down to the Aboriginals, if they talked to them at all. And it was horrific what happened to some of those families. It really was. And it's still something, as anyone who saw the documentary the BBC aired last November, it's still something which causes a lot of scars and a lot of pain to their descendants who have only very recently been able to go back into that area. And even now, they're not allowed to camp overnight or eat in some places because they will simply never be safe.
Yeah, the documentary is still on BBC iPlayer, so I'll place some links in the episode notes so people can take a look at that. With the military personnel, were they given any option to not participate in these tests?
Members of the military are never given any option to say, would you like to do this, soldier? It's very much a case of, you are going to do this, you are going to do that. If you had refused your posting or raised concerns, you would firstly risk jail, whether you were on national service or you're a regular serviceman. That's just a court-martial offence and you're in real trouble. And secondly, considering the atmosphere at home at the time of Soviet spies, of Reds under the bed, of militant trade unions questioning the need for these nuclear weapons tests, and it was their hippy dippy end of society. It was C&D, it was the Quakers, and so on, which were agitated against the nuclear weapons tests from about 1957, 58 onwards. You didn't want to be seen as one of them. And added to which, if you and all your unit, if you're an 18-year-old lad and your sergeant and your CO and the colonel, you sit down and have a little meeting or a little explanation about how you're doing some nuclear weapons explosions and there are some safety limits and you'll be perfectly fine, do as you're told, well, then you believe it. And all these people, every veteran I've ever spoken to has been very proud to serve their country. They've been proud to serve their queen. They're not all dyed-in-the-wool unquestioning patriots. And some of them are very anti-nuclear weapons now. Others are still very pro them. But they believe what they were told. And they didn't have an option. You would have risked social ostracization, jail, the end of your marriage, the loss of your home if you were living on base. There's no way you could have questioned it. And you had no reason to, because what information were you given to make you question what was going on? None whatsoever.
There are so many places in this book where my jaw drops open at what you're describing and what's going on. And I guess one of them is when somebody comes up with a bright idea of allowing some families of servicemen to come and visit them on the test sites.
Yeah, so it was at one point, this is one of the really detailed things about this book is there's so much to try and fit into just 250 pages. And I could sit and do this for a decade. I've emptied pubs on this topic, as I'm sure your readers are probably finding the listeners are probably finding right now. But at one stage, they'd moved from Maralinga to Christmas Island, now known as, well, it's still known Christmas, but it's part of the Kiribati Republic. It's an island literally on the other side of the globe to Britain. You can't go further away from Britain without starting to come back to it again. It is as far away from us as it's possible to detonate a nuclear weapon. And they went to Christmas Island to do the thermonuclear weapons test. So when you get an atom bomb, basically, and blow up another atom bomb with it, you wrap two of them together and you have fission from the first bomb, and then there's another explosion, you get fusion. You smash all the atoms back together. It's much, much more powerful. It's exponentially stronger and bigger. And it was, it is the atom bomb is a pea shooter compared to what you can do with an H bomb. They wanted to do this at Christmas Island. And so they moved out there and they did everything in a bit of a rush in what was called Operation Grapple, because there were so much agitating going on internationally against the nuclear weapons test. This was 1957. Everyone was getting quite tired of it. There was talk about finding H-bomb dust from the Americans in Welsh sheep and stuff. It was a nightmare. Get it done and get it, under the wire before an international ban comes in and we can't do any more. And they exploded 3 H-bombs and every single one of them fizzled. Every one was a disaster. They were massive, massive weapons. I think one of them was 700 megatons, but it still wasn't thermonuclear. And the worst thing was that Britain put out to everybody that it was an H-bomb. The Daily Mirror, who had our columnist Cassandra, Bill O'Connor there, he believed the propaganda he was told. So, it just had an H-bomb. This was a dress rehearsal for the end of the world. This amazing purple prose he wrote about witnessing it. Completely unaware it was a failure. And part of the problem was that the Americans were there at the time and they had seen it. They'd been invited as observers. And I think one of them said to Ginger Weir, he was the Air Vice Marshal who was in charge of it at the time, who said, well, how very wise of you to start off small and work your way up. Devastating burn when you've just spent hundreds of millions of pounds on H-bombs that didn't go the way you wanted them to. And so they had a bit of a disaster. And what are we going to do? We've got bans coming in. We haven't got the H-bomb. We've really got to get the H-bomb. We're on the other side of the world. Shit. And so the decision was made, well, we've got to do it again. We've got to do it very, 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 very quickly. And rather than do it on the island a little bit away where we did the last ones, in order to make it quicker and cheaper, we're going to do it on Christmas Island where the troops are this time. And all the troops had to stay there basically for an extra year. Now, by this point, they'd been on the other side of the world for probably 6 months or a year. They were all due leave. They had witnessed some more H-bombs, which are quite devastating. They were getting letters from girlfriends back home, lots of Dear John letters from girls who were reading the newspapers back home and talk of radiation and deformities. And do you know what? I'm going to marry someone else. So they were dumping him while he was out there. He wasn't coming back. He was staying for an extra year suddenly. Morale really hit rock bottom. And so one particular guy, it's a chap called Colonel Henry Gatford, who was the commanding officer of 25th Field Regiment, the Royal Engineers. He had 400 men on Christmas Island. They'd been there for a year. Some of them were going to go home. They were getting switched out for others that were coming out. And he came up with this great wheeze. Well, why don't we, seeing as there's an empty ship almost coming out with some replacement troops for my guys, why don't we get some of the wives and girlfriends of my guys to come out with them? There's some spare bunks, it'll be a lovely little jaunt for them. And so that's what they did. And the troop ship was called Danera, and they had about 30 wives and children on there, babies as well. And I've spoken to a few of them who, at the time, it all seemed like a whizzy, cheap, subsidized sunshine holiday, 6 weeks and go and see a fella on a tropical island, It was all just funny. They even joked about how they would come back glowing. But, of course, the tropical island, they're only there for a few days at Christmas Island, but actually it was a pretty horrible place. It was rat infested. There were land crabs the size of a small child who was scuttling through the tents. The guys had not liked it at all. Their uniforms had been rotting in the humidity. They were desperate to come home. And then your wife and your child turns up. It's all, oh God, The troops then get back on the ship and come home, and they were photographed by the Mirror, come the way back through Honolulu, I think. And it all seemed jolly lovely. One mum told me, her toddler's hair fell out on the trip back. And she later needed sort of surgery for cervical problems. And they had their blood tested, one of the mums said, before they went and when they came back. And they have never found the results of the blood tests or what happened to them. And it just, now, it seems like, what were you doing? Who on earth would have thought these days that you should ship some wives and children out to Camp Bastion when the lads are coming back? Obviously, that would be dangerous. At the time, it seemed like it was being used as propaganda. There was lots of stuff going on at home about how dire this was, how poisonous it was, and it was. I think there was some concern that the truth about the failures would come out, and so it was just decided that this would be a great deflection. The newspapers could cover it. There was lots of various bits of propaganda that went on while the troops on Christmas Island. At one point, they were photographed addressing Christmas presents to children in hospital back at home. But at the same time, in Parliament, there were lots of debates about troops writing home going, something's wrong here. This is horrible, and complaining and other issues. So the idea of sending the wives and girlfriends out, I think, was just it was a PR stunt and a morale booster for those troops who did have a wife who could come and get them and was still interested in speaking to them rather than sending them a Dear John letter.
You mentioned earlier that some of the girlfriends are ditching their fellas because they've heard stories about deformities and things like that. So was there information dribbling back to the British public about the dangers of radiation?
I think everyone was aware that radiation was a bad thing, and that was why you needed weapons. I think that the population in general obviously knew that Japan had been devastated by this stuff. But at the same time, you also had this kind of pop culture growing up. You had Godzilla, the creature that was created out of radiation off the coast of Japan, who came in and caused problems. And you had various stories and issues and leaks and people warnings that this could lead to whether it's Spider-Man or, a deformity for your child. People were definitely starting to be aware of some of the risks, but how accurate any of that was. And I think it was just decided better not to discuss anything like that publicly and just leave it to the press to do their wild speculation. The government certainly didn't correct anyone's attitude. They had some issues with propaganda, because even when Churchill wrote his fare to the Commons about Operation Hurricane back in 1952, he was being advised to tone it down a bit with the stuff he was saying because it interfered with the propaganda that was being fed civilians back home. So, and I can remember some of this when I was growing up in the 80s, for goodness sake. There was occasionally, warnings, if there is a nuclear attack, this is what you can do to save yourself. Hide under the table, put a newspaper over your head, all kinds of strange and weird and amazing stuff. They were telling people in Britain in the 1950s, you'll be safe a mile away from the attack. And so Churchill was told not to point out that most of the troops were 6 miles away from Operation Hurricane, because then everyone would go, well, aren't we 6 miles away then? What happens if you're 1 mile away? And so I think the government's long-term attitude that these men were entirely safe is partly tied in to its own propaganda that the British population was going to be safe. It's kind of painted itself into a logical corner. It doesn't know how to get its way out of this now without admitting it lied somewhere to somebody. And that's why we are where we are.
You mentioned that the wives and the children coming back on the ship, they had a blood test beforehand and then a blood test after. And then there's no record of those blood tests. Now, a common theme within this story is missing medical records.
The veterans always said to me their records were missing. And I've been doing this since about 2006. That's what's 19 years now. And I've spent to a lot of them in that time. And every single one has at some point said, well, my medical records aren't quite right. And probably like most of your listeners, you think, well, this is 70 years old, 60 years old, some of these records. Of course, bits are going to have gone astray. You know, they're all done on bits of paper. They're all stuck together with a paper clip. Something will have fallen out. And that was why I always thought, you know, that there was nothing much in what they were arguing. But there were multiple court cases in which they said my records are missing, and the government said, no, we've looked for everything. We haven't got anything else. This is it. You've got everything we've got. And then it was 2022, so just over 2 years ago, and I got sent a document and I had this sort of epiphany, and I went, oh my God, they were right, because it was a series of blood tests on a squadron leader called Terry Gledhill, who was the man in charge of the sniff planes who were flying samples through the mushroom clouds at Operation Grapple in 58 at Christmas Island. And it showed a series of blood tests he'd had, which are being discussed by scientists, the AWE guys who were at Christmas Island, and they were sending this telegram back to Aldermaston going, what do we do about this? He's got gross irregularities in his blood. And I just went, good Lord, they were taking their blood. If you're taking the blood of a man who's leading his planes through the mushroom clouds, and the RAF crews were arguably the most exposed, well, then there's results for those blood tests, and you're doing all of them. Why are you doing this? And it had in that memo an Air Ministry order, which was the basis of doing the test. So he went and found that order, and it said all crews, you know, who may be exposed should have this, that, and the other done, and these are the limits beyond which they won't be allowed to fly again, and all this. And this is just, I've never heard this. This is bizarre. I tracked down his family. He had died a few years previous to this, but they'd never heard anything about blood tests. And they said, well, he spent years asking questions about why he was so ill, and he didn't understand why he was ill or what was wrong with him. It never really got explained. They then agreed to ask for his medical records and were refused. And at that point, I said, well, this is a whole new scandal. This is a story now. It's a crime. It's illegal to withhold or destroy or falsify a medical record. It's always been a civil offence, even back in the 1950s. And it's a reason that you would strike off a medical practitioner. You wouldn't be allowed to practice again. And if they were taking blood tests for Terry Gledhill, then they must have done every other pilot in his squadron. And if they've done the pilots in his squadron, they'll have done the navigators and the wireless operators. And if they've done those guys, they've probably done the ground crew that were involved in decontamination, because they had their heads in the engine afterwards. And if they did it on those guys, who else did they do it to? So that one Air Ministry order led us to Admiralty orders, to other Air Ministry orders over years, to War Office instructions. And it's got to the point where we now have orders covering thousands of troops over more than a decade in all three services, at Christmas Island and at Maralinga, to have their blood tested. And there is now this sort of final court case, which is the last chance for the veterans to actually get to the truth. And unlike all previous cases, it's not about injury. It's not trying to claim that these men were definitely injured by radiation. That's something which science is still finding very difficult to establish, or at least to the MOD's satisfaction. They can establish it to everybody else's satisfaction, but not the British government. But this latest claim is about those medical records. It's about saying, well, you should have taken our blood tests. If so, I would like them, please. If you don't have them anymore because you've lost them or you've destroyed them, then that's medical negligence and you owe compensation. And if you never took them in the first place, seeing as you had an order to do it, that's also medical negligence and compensation. And if you took them and you hid them, that's really bad and compensation. Now, I was in a meeting with a government minister a little while ago who said, well, it's possible these orders were given but were never followed. And I said, right, okay. This is a massive bureaucracy in the armed forces at best. Right? It is something that if you were ordered to do it in triplicate, you do it in quadruplicate, and then you triple check your answers afterwards. And if there's a piece of paper that says you use Form A20 to perform function 6C and you do it 3 times a day, then that's what they do. And if they had an order for all three armed forces covering thousands of troops and hundreds of units over more than a decade in 2 or 3 different locations to do something, the chances that you don't have hundreds of blood test results out of that are slim to non-existent. And if they really didn't happen, then you will have had the biggest spontaneous campaign of insubordination the armed forces has ever witnessed. And no one was court-martialed for it. No one in London ever said, hang on, where are those blood tests that I ordered 6 months ago? No one ever told anyone else off. And the distribution lists for these orders, they go to about 14, 15, 16, 20 people, from the stationary guy to the CO to the quartermaster to all the medics. You really want to say that all of those officers of the British Armed Forces went, nah, can't be bothered, I'm a long way from home, I'm not going to do it. Yeah, that might have happened once or twice, but it's not going to happen consistently. So those blood tests, that one memo from Terry Gledhill, has led to evidence that it must have happened many, many, many more times. And we've had lots of veterans now who've, using recent changes in legislation, Data Protection Act, for example, have been able to access their own medical records, some of them for the first time, and find that bits are missing. And the bits that are missing are not, the thing you would expect to be lost from a 2-inch thick pile of paperwork, the bit off the back or a bit out of the middle. It's not a clump that's missing. It is only the bits that are specific to the nuclear weapons tests. So John Robinson, who I think you've interviewed in this podcast before, when he thought there was nothing much amiss, he didn't remember any blood tests. When he got his medical records and he looked at them, he found 4.5 years had been taken out. And they only covered his time at the weapons test that he was at. There's another chap who was at some of the same tests who was found 14 months has gone. And it's from the time that he left. You can see his preliminary warning roll medical. And then there's no more medical records until he's come back from Maralinga. And there's veteran after veteran who are just finding it's been filleted. It hasn't been lost. There hasn't been a fire or a bit of asbestos contamination. Something has been intentionally taken out of those files between very specific dates. There's one veteran who was at Operation Grapple on Christmas Island, who years ago, before all this, had made a data protection request for his medical records. He had them. He said, I've got them all already. They're all here. And he showed me very proudly. And it's, he'd spent 30 years in the RAF. So this thing was about 3 inches thick. It had every time you'd been to see the medic, every time you sprained your ankle, every time you had a runny nose, every time you took a pill for something. And I had to spread it all out on my floor in my office up here and try and put sticky papers all over it and try and figure out what was there, what wasn't there. And the period of his time at the test, there was stuff in there from then. I thought, well, what's wrong here? There must be something wrong. I know there is. I just can't put my finger on it. And I went back on the front of this because he'd made a data protection request. There was a schedule of the documents in his log. And it said, we have 30 annual medicals. We have so many of this. We have so many of the other, so many of the other. And I went through and ticked it off. We've got that. I've got that. I've got that. What was missing? 20 years of annual medicals had just gone, which means someone had gone through his file and licked their finger, thumb through it, taken one piece of paper out, thumb through it again, taken another piece of paper out, thumb through it again for 20 years. And it's just astonishing. And then you find I've got another one at the moment who his family have got the medical record, but it seems to have been edited by someone because over a course of about 10 years, it's the same handwriting, putting in every entry, and bits are missing that should be in there. And then magically, it's the same handwriting, putting things through. In about 1959, they've gone back and they've changed something in that file. And it's so frustrating because these guys have known it all along. They haven't had the access to it. They haven't had the knowledge to access it. They're still not being given help to access this stuff. And it's a really complex process to try and get your medical records out of the military, in the best of times. But when you're 85 or 86, as the survivors are now, or even if you've passed away and it's your next of kin doing it, it's really, really tricky. And they don't want to give it to anybody. Everything we've got out of them has been like getting blood out of a stone. Their attitude towards people who have served their country, and I know this applies to multiple veterans of different actions of various sorts, but their attitude is very much, well, you're of no use to us anymore. Why do we care about you? And there's no care, there's no help, there's no consideration. There's just people like me being a pain in the neck for the Ministry of Defence. And Lab Rats, the main campaign group, which has sort of been going on now, I think, for the campaign itself has been going on in various forms about 40 years, trying to get to truth and justice. And they're just dismissed as troublemakers and, an irritant to those in power.
Well, thank goodness you and the Lab Rats and the other campaigners are being a pain.
That's the thing about tabloid journalists, is that eventually you boils down to the fact you just like annoying people, especially if you think they've done something wrong, and you keep going and niggling at it.
We've talked about the veterans being affected by the radiation, but what are the sort of health issues that they and their families are experiencing? And also you mentioned before some of the psychological and social impacts that they're experiencing.
Yeah, anecdotally, what you can say is that the veterans themselves report a very high rate of unusual medical conditions, blood disorders, cancers. Their wives have reported about 3 times the normal rate of miscarriage, and their children show roughly about 10% the normal rate of birth defects. The normal natural birth defect rate in this country is about 2% of all births, and in veterans it's 20% or so as an average. But I've interviewed families where the rate of birth defect is about 35%, and I've interviewed women who have lost more than 12 babies, sometimes late term. So there's people who've had 1 or 2 miscarriages, and there's people who've had a dozen, and that is very traumatizing. There's no way round that. It's always been traumatizing. And the way miscarriage has been treated over the years has been quite poor. And then you've got on top of that, this kind of constant questioning about whether or not it's been caused by the radiation. So a lot of the veterans that I've spoken to will say, I blame myself for my son's problems or my daughter's problems. I think it's my fault I was there. And even the ones who've died, their families will tell me that. The wives wonder if it was something wrong with them or whether it was something wrong with their husband. The wives have to care for a husband who gets ill sooner, often, as well as perhaps children that are unwell. And the children themselves then grow up and wonder what on earth is going on and what they should do with their lives. There's one who's done a lot of our campaigning work called Steve Peirce. His dad was at Maralinga for Operation Vixen in 1963, which was a series of tests on broken arrow incidents. What would happen in a nuclear weapon if it was caught in a fire, or if you dropped it or something like that. And there was a lot of very toxic contamination after Vixen B. And Steve was born a few years later with disabilities that can't be diagnosed. He's got short stature. He had hydrocephaly. He had a knee twisted the wrong way. He has undeveloped lungs. He's in a wheelchair now. He's in his 50s. When I first met him, he said, well, I'm never going to have children because I don't know if I'd pass it on. I don't want to. Then he met someone and he fell in love. And, blind optimist that he is, and so many of us are when we fall in love, they decided they would give it a try. And at every scan, Steve was saying, is the baby okay? Is the baby okay? Far more than any normal expectant father would be. Are all his limbs the right length? And then when their son Sasha was born, it was perfect and everything seemed fine. He's about 3 now, and a little while ago, he started coming up to his dad and saying, Daddy, my teeth hurt. And they took him to the dentist, and his enamel was disappearing. And that isn't because he was eating sweets. The dentist looked at it and said, well, this can be genetic, and it can be something that happens when you're exposed to radiation as well. And he's 3 years old. He had to undergo general anaesthetic and have 6 teeth removed. And it's that kind of questioning. And for Steve, he's probably not got the kind of health which is going to see him into his 90s. He's very worried that when he goes, Sasha is not going to have the answers to what's wrong with him. And when he goes to see the doctor, that, Steve knows what it's like to go to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, I don't know what you've got, so I don't really know how to treat you. And he doesn't want that for his son. And he's worried that is what's going to happen. And that over time, even the government's own studies show that the latest one shows that there is an increased risk of death among test veterans and an increased risk of cancer. It's slight, it's only a few percent, but it is there. But when you drill into the data of the latest study, the findings are actually pretty devastating for some cases. So the chance of a condition called chronic myeloid leukemia, which is a kind of blood cancer that's caused by radiation, it's 345% more likely if you are a nuclear veteran. On some missions, you have a much, much higher rate of different cancers. So if you were in groups that the MOD considered likely to be exposed, so it's like the RAF air crews, you're twice as likely to have leukemia. You're twice as likely to have a tumour of the brain or central nervous stem if you were at Maralinga. You're 3 times more likely to kill yourself if you were in amongst 1,000 men at Maralinga.
So these are government figures. They're government statistics.
I'm quoting to you now from a government statistical report, which is the 4th one they've done over a period of time. The first one in 1988, they said, well, it didn't show much damage, don't worry about it. Every test since then, they've said, doesn't it change anything? We managed to win a fresh study using all the old data and updating it as we went along in 2018. It was published 2 years ago. And this is the one that the first time said there is an increased risk for the nuclear veterans. And the one thing which increases every decade since the test, in which their risk is increasing and which they are more likely to suffer and die from than any other group of veterans, is suicide and self-harm. And I would argue that's because they've been gaslighted so comprehensively. It's put so much stress on families, not just the families that stay together, but the families that are estranged, that fall apart, that don't talk to each other anymore. That the risks of suicide should be something which the government is concerned about. And the MOD often, wants to tweet about what it does about troops' mental health and so on. When this study came out, the government looked at it and said, well, we see no reason to change our previous stance. And that's still what they say now.
With statistics like that, I can't see how they can say there isn't a linkage between what these guys experienced at these tests.
They misunderstand the science at every point, and they do so willfully. And I've explained this to multiple ministers who some of them aren't very bright, but they don't get it. The study is into comparing the nuclear veterans compared to another group of veterans who are serving at the same time somewhere away from the nuclear test. So, Korea, for example, Aden, someone like that. They're in the tropics, but they're not being exposed to radiation. So the chances of these veterans having a problem compared to the other veterans. And every time the government wants to talk about this study, they say, well, compared to the general population, the veterans have got no issue. Well, because they die at similar rates. Well, of course they die at similar rates. The general population is people like me who sit on our arses for 12 hours a day, people who drink too much, people who smoke, people who are born with a gammy leg, people who are too short-sighted to ever get into the military. The military and science, and the reason this study was designed the way it was, is because everyone knows there's something called the healthy soldier effect. That people who are serving the military are automatically the healthiest people you've got in your country. They're the ones who can run fastest and fight longest. And, I used to be a defence reporter in Plymouth. I would go out down Union Street with my girls looking for some of the boys quite regularly. And tell you now, if there was a young 18-year-old Matlow having a fight with some local 18-year-old who was not in the military and they both had 15 pints, the Matlow was going to win because they're just healthier and stronger. They live, once they're working in the armed forces, they're better trained and exercised, and they've obviously got a good genetic hand to start with. And at the nuclear tests, they selected them again out of those. The guys who I've spoken to said, well, we were picked out of our unit and put together in a new unit. And they were the ones that were sent to Christmas Island. It was the regimental boxers. It was the runners. It was the ones who were the fittest and the healthiest who were selected for service in the tropics because it was more arduous. And the veterans would say, well, they picked the best because they wanted to test us in particular because of radiation. So when people like that are suffering cancer at the same rate as the rest of us, that is the problem. And I've explained that to so many people, it makes my eyes bleed. But the government still says, well, there's no evidence that they suffer worse than the general population. The general population hasn't been to a bloody bomb test. If you expose the general population to that, you're going to find that we'll probably die of cancer more than the nuclear veterans do. The fact that there are some of them at 86 still knocking about on their 90th skin cancer and their umpteenth chronic long-term condition, despite the fact they lost all their teeth at 22, and they've had huge amounts of trauma and stress for many, many years, is amazing. And it's because they were so healthy to start with that we've still got any to talk about today. The fact that, the studies show they have a slight increase in cancer is, compared to the general population and compared to other veterans, is the astonishing thing to me. And they willfully misinterpret it, because to interpret it in a way that makes any sense by actually reading the whole study from cover to cover, as I do, would mean you have to reverse your entire position. And doing that is expensive and embarrassing, and no institution likes admitting they've got something wrong.
Has any estimate been made as to what or how much the compensation would be?
The latest estimate for the current case is about 5 billion. That would be twice what the post office scandal was. Some of it is cloud cuckoo land stuff, because you're calculating on the basis of who knows what. That's if a court decides to give you damages and costs and aggravated damages because you didn't settle the case when you should have done, and maybe even punitive damages because something's gone horribly wrong. It could be much less than that. It could even be much more than that. I mean, it's a fairly conservative figure. In the early noughties, there was a court case that got started 2007, got to the Supreme Court by about 2012. That could have been settled for about 20-25 million. And the government, somebody in the government blocked that settlement ever being made to the other side, so it never did get settled. And most of the people who are involved in that case now have died. And the veterans say that the MOD's handling of this has always been exactly the same, which is to delay and deny until they die. We just have to be more hopeful now that we have the first Prime Minister, as far as we know in history, who knows about this. As far as we're aware, all the other Prime Ministers who were asked to do something about this never knew what we've found out in the last couple of years. Keir Starmer has met Steve Pearce. He's met nuclear veterans. He's promised them his support. And the latest I've heard there is an investigation underway in the MOD now into whether they can find what I've found, basically. And the word I'm getting back is we don't know how she found it, because we can't get the answers out of the atomic weapons establishment. But they are looking into it, and I think some of this stuff is going to start getting declassified, and I think we will see some movement. How good that movement is, I wouldn't like to say. I think we're still going to be here for some time to come.
Wow. Well, Susie, thanks so much for sharing this story with me. If people want to get behind the Veterans Campaign, where's the best place for them to go?
Crikey. If they want to get behind the Veterans Campaign, the main campaign group is called Lab Rats, Atomic Lab Rats. You'll find them on social media, and they have a webpage. I run a Facebook group called Justice for Nuclear Veterans, which is where all my stories and the latest campaign news goes. We've also got a crowdfunder for the legal case, because the veterans are having to fund it all themselves. There is no opportunity for anyone to help them with this. When they need a couple of £100,000, they're on about 70,000 at the moment. So if you search for nuclear veterans and crowdfunder on Google, it should pop up. It's on the Crowd Justice website. But basically, the way people can support the most is just to listen to these guys, to ask them to be heard by others, to contact your MP. If you find yourself next to Keir Starmer at any point, give him a nudge and say, "Oi, what are you going to do about this? Have you read Susie's book?" Because it's all in there. It's not difficult to find some of this stuff. It's just, it has to be dealt with. And my big fear is that it will happen so slowly, especially with the cautious government we have at the moment now, who likes to do everything in an evidence-based way and drag it out as much as possible, that by the time there is any kind of justice, it will get announced to a room that is empty apart from me and maybe a few descendants, and there won't be any veterans left to actually hear it.
Susie's book is called Exposed, The Secret History of Britain's Nuclear Experiments. It's published by Pen and Sword. There'll be links in the episode notes, as well as links to all the campaigning groups that we've mentioned. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.